The wind tugged at Cassidy's scarf as she stood at the entrance to the carnival, her kite bag slung over one shoulder. Above her, streamers and strings of lights swayed in the breeze, their colors vivid against the pale blue sky. The air hummed with energy, the distant trill of a carousel, the sharp crackle of popcorn popping, the laughter of children darting through the crowd. But Cassidy wasn't here for the rides or the games. Her eyes scanned the field just beyond the chaos of the midway, where a group of kite flyers had already staked out their territory. A dozen kites, all shapes and sizes, danced and dipped in the sky, their tails trailing like whispers. She adjusted the strap digging into her shoulder and took a steadying breath. People. There would be people to meet, to talk to impress. She tugged her knit cap lower over her ears, muttering under her breath. It's just wind and lift. Nothing unpredictable about it. That was the thing about kites, they made sense. They obeyed the rules: velocity, angle, pressure. People, on the other hand, were messy and chaotic. Cassidy preferred the silence of the clouds to the noise of conversation. Still, here she was. The carnival ground beneath her boots crunched as she approached the meetup area, keeping her gaze fixed on the sky. She didn't want to make eye contact just yet. She recognized a few kites, a sleek delta with a bold lightning bolt stitched across it, a box kite painted like a checkerboard, a dragon-shaped one with wings that flapped in the wind. Veterans of the local competition circuit. Cassidy had flown against some of them before, and she knew better than to underestimate their skill. A pang of nervousness laced her excitement, but it was soon drowned out by the familiar rush of anticipation. Unzipping her bag, she pulled out her newest creation, a fiery orange stunt kite with long flowing tails that she'd spent weeks perfecting. It wasn't flashy, but it was hers, balanced, precise, reliable. She ran her fingers across the taut fabric, feeling the seams that she'd sewn herself. Okay, she whispered to no one in particular. Let's show them what you can do. Hey there, nice kite, Cassidy startled, her hand pausing mid-check. A man with an easy grin and a mop of tousled dark hair was standing a few feet away, holding an enormous kite shaped like a pirate ship. Sails, rigging, cannon ports, the thing was ridiculous and yet somehow majestic. Who brought something like that to a competition? He looked at her expectantly, waiting for her to respond. Thanks, she said cautiously, pulling the brim of her hat lower. Yours is ambitious. He laughed, a deep, resonant sound that carried over the field. Ambitious is a nice way of saying completely impractical, but I'll take it. He tilted his head, studying her. You're Cassidy, right? The meteorologist? Her stomach clenched. How'd you know that? Word gets around. Besides, people talk about you like you've got a secret weapon or something. Guess I'll find out if it's true. He gave her a wink before walking off toward the field, his pirate ship kite swaying in his hands. Cassidy stared after him, bemused. She shook her head, planted her feet, and focused on assembling her kite. The wind was steady, promising perfect flying conditions. Let him think what he wanted. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to fly. The competition was already underway by the time Cassidy stepped onto the field, her orange kite gleaming in the golden afternoon light. She adjusted the tension on her lines, her gaze fixed upward as the sky came alive with shapes and colors. Kites looped and dipped, their tails snapping in the breeze like tiny banners of defiance. The energy of the crowd rippled behind her, murmurs of appreciation and bursts of applause, punctuating the drone of the announcer's voice over the loudspeaker. Cassidy's heart thundered in time with the wind. This, she understood. The rhythm of it, the way the kite responded to her every twitch of the line. No chaos, just control. She exhaled and launched her kite into the sky. It soared easily, cutting through the air with a sharp precision that made her chest swell with pride. She guided it into a series of quick dives and tight loops, testing the wind's resistance. Around her, competitors were locked in their own aerial dances, but Cassidy barely noticed, until a shadow crossed in front of her kite. She blinked, taken aback, as a massive black and white monstrosity drifted into her airspace. It took her a moment to process what she was looking at. The pirate ship. Sails billowing, cannons painted on its sides. It loomed like something out of a cartoon, and it was flying dangerously close to her kite. "Hey," she called out, her voice sharp over the wind. "Watch your lines!" "Sorry," She's a bit unruly today." The response came from the man she'd met earlier, the one with the easy grin and the entirely too big personality. He was standing several yards away, his hands working the lines with an exaggerated flourish. His kite dipped and swayed like it had a mind of its own, veering perilously close to hers again. She narrowed her eyes, angling her kite away before he could tangle their lines. "Unruly? You don't say?" she muttered under her breath, turning her focus back to her own performance. But no sooner had she smoothed out her pattern than the pirate ship swooped by again, its tail flapping like a taunt. This time, it was followed by a loud whoop from its operator. "Looks like our kites are destined to meet," he called, his grin audible in his voice. Cassidy ground her teeth, yanking her kite upward into a sharp ascent. "Or collide," she shot back, her tone clipped. He laughed, a deep, resonant laugh that somehow softened the edge of her irritation. "Relax, meteorologist," he said, loud enough for her to hear. "I'm just giving your secret weapon a little competition." Her kite dipped slightly as her focus wavered. "What are you even doing?" she demanded, glancing toward him. "This isn't a game. If you're not careful, you'll..." "Lose?" he smirked, tilting his head. "Not my style." "No, 'cause a pile-up," she snapped. "You're flying that thing like a wrecking ball." "Come on now," he said, his tone mock-wounded. "Wrecking balls don't have sails." Cassidy huffed, turning her attention back to her kite. "Unbelievable," she muttered, though she couldn't entirely suppress the flicker of amusement creeping into her chest. He was infuriating, and yet, as his kite circled hers, she felt a pull, not just of annoyance, but of something more curious, more electric. Like he was testing her resolve, daring her to look away from her rules and into the unpredictable. The wind carried the scent of spun sugar and frying dough as Cassidy tightened her grip on her kite's lines. The orange tails of her creation flicked back and forth as it danced higher in the sky, slicing through invisible currents. She didn't need to look to know Leo's pirate ship kite was nearby. Its ridiculous bulk cast a shadow that wouldn't go away, like a boast she couldn't ignore. She could hear his low chuckle over the carnival noise, and it was beginning to get under her skin, although she wasn't entirely sure why. "Careful now, Cassidy," Leo called out, his tone teasing. "I think your kite's getting nervous. She might not be able to handle my ship's starboard attack." Cassidy snorted, her lips curving despite herself. "Don't flatter yourself. Your kite looks like it belongs in a wind tunnel safety test." "Hey, that's an insult to all pirate enthusiasts." He grinned, his hands working the lines with a surprising grace. The pirate ship dipped suddenly, and Cassidy's kite swooped instinctively in response, their tails brushing for a fleeting moment. Cassidy's heart skipped, though she wasn't sure if it was from the near miss or the way Leo's eyes flicked toward her, mischievous and bright. "Are you trying to crash into me, or is this just your idea of flirting?" she shot back, narrowing her eyes. Leo gasped in mock outrage, clutching at his chest as if she'd wounded him. "Flirting? Me? I'm a gentleman, Cassidy. I would never resort to such underhanded tactics." His grin said otherwise. "Uh-huh. Tell that to your kite," she muttered, yanking her lines to guide her orange stunt kite through a sharp corkscrew maneuver. It sliced past the pirate ship with precision, the wind whistling as it cut through the air. The crowd watching from the sidelines let out an appreciative cheer, and Cassidy couldn't help but feel a burst of pride. "See that? That's control. You should try it sometime." Leo raised a brow, his grin widening. "Control's overrated. Where's the fun in that?" With a flick of his wrist, the pirate ship suddenly shot upward, its sails catching a gust of wind and sending it into an exaggerated barrel roll. Sometimes you just have to let the wind do its thing. Surrender a little. "Surrender," Cassidy echoed, shaking her head. "That's a great strategy. For losing. Or for winning in ways that matter," he countered, his voice dipping just slightly, enough to catch her off guard. His gaze lingered on her for a moment before returning to his kite. Cassidy felt herself falter, her kite veering off course, her focus slipped. She quickly recovered, biting the inside of her cheek. She didn't respond right away, her attention fixed on guiding her kite back into rhythm. But the easy way Leo spoke, the way he seemed so at home in the chaos of the carnival and the wind, it tugged at something deep in her. Annoyance, she told herself. Pure annoyance, and yet Okay, Captain Chaos, she finally said. If you're so into surrendering, let's see you keep up with this. With a flick of her wrist, she sent her orange kite into a daring dive, pulling it back into a series of looping spirals that made the crowd gasp. Leo whistled, impressed. Well, seems the meteorologist has some tricks up her sleeve after all. I've got more than that, she said, her lips twitching into a smirk. Good, he replied, his voice low, playful, because I don't think you've seen anything yet. Their kites tangled briefly again as the wind pushed them together, and for once, Cassidy didn't pull away right away. Instead, she glanced at Leo, finding his grin infectious and his gaze steady. For a moment, the carnival noise dimmed, and it was just the two of them, their kites playing together in the open sky. Careful, Cassidy, he said softly, his voice carrying just enough of a challenge to make her heartbeat quicken. You might actually be having fun. The Ferris wheel loomed above them like a sentinel, its metal frame gleaming in the fading light of day. Cassidy sat cross-legged on a patch of grass beneath it, her orange kite resting beside her. The crisp evening air smelled of caramel apples, and something faintly metallic, like the promise of rain. Leo flopped down beside her, stretching out on his back with a contented sigh, his pirate ship kite crumpled into a deflated heap nearby. Not bad today, meteorologist, he said, tilting his head to look at her. You kept up. Cassidy snorted, pulling off her knit cap to let the cool breeze ruffle her hair. Kept up? I ran circles around you. Oh, absolutely, he said with mock seriousness, his grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. You're clearly a kite-flying goddess, and I'm just a lowly pirate in the sky. She rolled her eyes but couldn't stop herself from smiling. He had a way of disarming her, like the wind tugging loose a kite string she always thought was secure. Silence settled between them for a moment, broken only by the distant hum of carnival music and the occasional whoosh of the Ferris wheel as it turned. Cassidy leaned back on her hands, letting her gaze drift upward to the colorful lights spinning above. I used to think Ferris wheels were the scariest ride at the carnival, she said suddenly, surprising herself as much as him. Something about being stuck at the top, all that space between you and the ground. Leo turned his head toward her, his expression curious but soft. And now? Cassidy shrugged. Now I think it's kind of peaceful. Like the world goes quiet for a bit when you're up there. No chaos, no noise, just the view. He studied her for a moment, his smile fading into something more thoughtful. You like quiet, don't you? She hesitated, her fingers picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. Yeah, my job's noisy enough with all the pressure systems and forecasts and people asking you to predict the unpredictable. Quiet makes sense. It's easier. Leo sat up, resting his elbows on his knees. Easier isn't always better, though. His voice was light, but there was something in his tone that made her glance at him. His usual grin was absent, replaced by a wistful look she hadn't seen before. What about you? She asked, deflecting. You're not exactly the quiet type. He chuckled, but there was a shadow of sadness in it. No, I guess not. I've always been the loud one, the guy who makes the dumb jokes, the guy people notice. He paused, his gaze dropping to his hands, but sometimes I wonder if people really see me, or if they just see the act. Cassidy blinked, caught off guard by his honesty. That's surprising, she admitted. You make it look so easy, the whole easygoing, nothing bothers me thing. It's not, he said simply, meeting her eyes. But I guess that's why I like kites. Up there, it's just you and the wind. No expectations, no pretending. It feels real. Her chest tightened at his words, and she didn't know why. She looked away, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Yeah, she said softly, I get that. They fell into silence again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. Cassidy found herself leaning closer to him, drawn to his warmth, his presence. The Ferris wheel above them creaked as it turned, its lights casting shifting patterns on the grass. You know, Leo said after a moment, his voice light again, we should go up there. He nodded toward the Ferris wheel. Cassidy raised an eyebrow. What, right now? Why not? He said, flashing her a grin. You said it's peaceful, right? Let's test your theory. She hesitated, then smiled despite herself. Fine, but if this is your way of trying to win our kite duel, it's not going to work. Leo laughed, standing and offering her his hand. No tricks, meteorologist, just a little adventure. Cassidy took his hand, letting him pull her to her feet. Somehow, she knew he meant more than just the ride, and for once, she wasn't afraid to see where the wind might take her. The carnival sparkled in the early evening, the fading sunlight blending with the neon glow of rides and string lights. Cassidy and Leo wove through the bustling midway, their kites safely stowed in the bags slung over their shoulders. The air was thick with the scent of fried food, and the occasional burst of laughter or song from a nearby game booth. A man on stilts wobbled past them, juggling neon rings, while a fire eater drew cheers from a small crowd to their right. It was chaos, and Cassidy would normally have hated it. Yet, with Leo at her side, the noise felt oddly exhilarating instead of overwhelming. "So," Leo said, his hands tucked into the pockets of his windbreaker, "how does someone who likes precise weather patterns and quiet evenings end up at a carnival kite competition? Don't tell me you're secretly a thrill-seeker in disguise." Cassidy smirked, sidestepping a gaggle of children chasing a balloon. "I like a little challenge now and then. Just because I enjoy predictability doesn't mean I never color outside the lines." "Oh, so you're a rebel. Got it." He grinned, his tone warm and teasing. "Let me guess, you're the kind of rebel who puts milk in the bowl before the cereal." "Gross," she said, wrinkling her nose. "What kind of monster does that?" Leo burst into laughter, the sound carrying over the din of the carnival. "Fair point. Maybe you're more of the park, illegally, once-in-a-blue-moon kind of rebel." Cassidy rolled her eyes, though she couldn't help the smile tugging at her lips. "You're really obsessed with this whole me-breaking-the-rules thing, aren't you?" "Not obsessed," he replied, bumping her shoulder lightly with his own as they walked. "Just intrigued. You've got this whole I-have-everything-under-control vibe, but the way you flew that kite today, that was pure chaos. Controlled chaos. Maybe, but still. You've got a wild streak hiding under that knit hat of yours." "Maybe chaos likes to borrow a little control now and then," Cassidy shot back, surprising herself with the flirtatious edge in her voice. Leo slowed, turning to face her. His grin softened into something less cocky, something more sincere. "Or maybe you've got more adventure in you than you think," he said. His gaze held hers, steady and curious, as though he were daring her to prove him right. "Adventure, huh?" she said, arching an eyebrow. "You mean like eating one of those terrifying fried Twinkies over there?" She nodded toward a stand where a teenage vendor was balancing a tray of unnaturally golden pastries. "Close," Leo said, a spark of mischief lighting his eyes. "But I was thinking bigger." "Bigger how?" Cassidy asked warily. "I'll show you," he said, grabbing her hand before she had time to protest. He led her toward a booth lined with colorful flags and a sign that read, "Tunnel of Terrors." Cassidy balked when she realized it was some kind of carnival funhouse ride, complete with spinning tunnels, mirrored walls, and a rickety set of tracks for a tiny two-seater cart. "Oh no," she said, planting her feet. "You are not dragging me into some death trap funhouse." "What's the matter?" he teased, keeping his grip on her hand firm. "Afraid of a little terror?" "Not terror," she shot back, "just questionable engineering." He laughed again, eyes bright. "Come on, meteorologist, where's your sense of rebellion?" Cassidy hesitated. The rational part of her screamed to walk away, but there was something about the way Leo was looking at her, like he wanted her to step out of her comfort zone just this once, that made her waver. Finally, with a groan, she let him pull her toward the ride. "Fine," she said, "but if I die in there, I'm haunting you forever." Leo grinned as they climbed into the cart together, the tiny space forcing their shoulders to press together. "Deal," he said. "But when we survive, maybe you'll admit that chaos isn't so bad." As the cart jerked forward and the ride plunged them into a swirl of flashing lights and twisting corridors, Cassidy found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in what felt like forever. Maybe chaos wasn't so bad after all. The wind was steady, carrying the faint scent of salt from the nearby ocean and the sugary sweetness of carnival treats. Cassidy's orange kite soared high above the grassy field, its tails rippling like streaks of fire against the deepening blue of the twilight sky. She held the lines tightly, every small tug and shift of her fingers making the kite respond with precision. It was a dance she had practiced countless times, a movement of trust and control between her and the wind. Leo's pirate ship kite hovered nearby, its absurd bulk and flapping sails seeming to defy logic. Yet, despite its gaudy size, it moved with surprising elegance under his guidance, dipping and ascending in time with Cassidy's movements. It circled her kite in a wide, sweeping arc before pulling up alongside it, the two of them momentarily suspended in the air, parallel and close. "They look pretty good together, don't they?" Leo called out, his voice carrying easily over the breeze. He was standing a few feet away, his stance loose but focused, hands deftly working the lines. "They're not together," Cassidy replied, her tone clipped but playful. "They're just sharing the same airspace." Leo grinned, his teeth flashing in the fading light. "Sharing airspace, huh? Sounds like a polite way of saying they're flirting." Cassidy rolled her eyes, though her lips twitched into a reluctant smile. "Flirting doesn't involve crashing into each other, which, by the way, your kite almost did 20 minutes ago." He laughed, a rich, easy sound, and Cassidy couldn't help but feel her shoulders relax despite herself. "You've got a point, but maybe they're more like us, figuring out how to fly in the same wind without getting tangled up." Her hands faltered on the lines for just a moment, her kite dipping before she righted it. She glanced at him, finding his gaze already on her, steady and open in a way that made her pulse quicken. She looked back at the sky, her throat tightening. "Flying in the same wind takes trust," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "Exactly," he said, his voice warm but earnest, "and maybe a little risk." He gave his lines a quick flick, and the pirate ship dipped dramatically before spinning into a playful barrel roll, its sails catching the light of the Ferris wheel in the distance. Cassidy's orange kite darted instinctively in response, twisting and looping upward as if answering his challenge. The two kites spiraled together, their tails brushing and tangling briefly before separating again. Cassidy's breath hitched as she watched them. It was mesmerizing how they moved together without ever fully colliding, how one seemed to follow the other's lead before switching roles, improvising a rhythm that was chaotic yet somehow harmonious. Her fingers tightened on the lines as a thought crept into her mind. Was it really just the kites, or was it something more? "You know," Leo said, his voice breaking through her thoughts, "I think they like each other." Cassidy snorted, shaking her head. "They're kites, Leo. They don't have feelings." "Sure they do," he said, a teasing lilt in his voice. "They've got wind in their sails and freedom in their strings. What more do they need?" She rolled her eyes, but the warmth in his tone made her chest ache in a way she wasn't prepared for. Against her better judgment, she glanced at him again. He wasn't looking at the kites anymore. His eyes were on her, the same steady, curious gaze he always seemed to have when he was trying to figure her out. It was infuriating and comforting all at once. "Watch your kite," she said quickly, her voice sharper than she intended. She jerked her lines, sending her orange kite into a dramatic dive that barely avoided his pirate ship. Leo's grin widened as he pulled his kite higher, giving hers space to climb back up. "Relax, Cassidy. You've got control, remember?" Her heart thudded as she watched the kites rise together again, their movements mirroring each other like a reflection on rippling water. Her guard felt like it was slipping, just a little, and for once, she wasn't sure she wanted to pull it back into place. "Maybe control's overrated," she murmured, her words barely audible over the wind. But Leo heard her anyway, and when his eyes lit up with that familiar spark, she felt her lips curve into a smile she couldn't suppress. Above them, their kites danced on, untethered and free. The Ferris wheel groaned softly as it climbed higher, the steady hum of its machinery blending with the distant carnival music below. Cassidy sat stiffly in the small, swaying gondola, her fingers gripping the metal bar in front of her. The lights of the carnival stretched out beneath her like a vibrant patchwork quilt, spinning rides, glowing tents, and the faint outlines of people moving like shadows against the kaleidoscopic backdrop. The air smelled of fried dough and electricity, a storm of sensations that only heightened the nervous fluttering in her chest. Across from her, Leo leaned back with his arms stretched lazily over the seat, the picture of ease. His dark hair was tousled by the breeze, and his pirate ship kite bag rested casually at his feet. His eyes, however, were fixed on her, their usual mischief tempered by something softer, something she couldn't quite name. "You're awfully quiet," he said, his voice low but teasing. "That high up, the world's supposed to go peaceful, isn't it? Or is it chaos that has you on edge?" Cassidy shot him a look, her lips twitching despite her best efforts not to smile. "You're the one who dragged me up here. Maybe I'm just bracing for whatever ridiculous thing you're planning." Leo grinned, leaning forward slightly. "Ridiculous? I'm offended. I was thinking of it more as memorable." The gondola rocked gently as they climbed closer to the top, the Ferris wheel pausing now and then to let passengers on and off. Cassidy's fingers tightened on the bar, her knuckles whitening. She averted her gaze, focusing instead on the horizon, where the last streaks of sunset clung stubbornly to the edges of the sky. The quiet up here really was different, thick and heavy, without the comforting hum of background noise. It made her feel exposed, like the wind could strip her bare. Leo's voice broke the silence, softer now. "I meant it, you know." Her brow furrowed and she looked back at him confused. "Meant what?" "That you're more adventurous than you think." He tilted his head, his gaze steady and unguarded in a way that made her heart stumble. "You're brave, Cassidy. Maybe not in the loud, obvious way, but in how you throw yourself into things that scare you. Like this carnival. Like kite flying. Like this." He gestured between them, his voice faltering just slightly. Cassidy felt heat rise to her cheeks. "This? Flying in a rickety Ferris wheel with a guy who nearly wrecked my kite earlier?" He laughed, that deep, rich sound that always seemed to cut through her defenses. "Yeah, that, but also this." He rubbed the back of his neck, for once looking unsure of himself. "Look, I'm not great at subtle, and I know you're not the type who likes big, messy emotions thrown at you, but—" He stopped, glancing out at the horizon like he needed to steady himself. When he turned back to her, his expression was uncharacteristically serious. "I don't want to waste time pretending this isn't something real." The Ferris wheel creaked to a halt, and Cassidy realized with a start that they were now at the very top. The gondola swung gently, suspended above the world. Below them, the carnival lights twinkled like stars, their glow reflected faintly in Leo's eyes. "I like you, Cassidy," he said, his voice clear and unflinching. "And I don't mean in some casual, let's fly kites together way. I mean in a you make me want to be better way. I can't stop thinking about you, about how you look when you're focused, or the way you laugh when you don't mean to, or how you pretend you don't care about winning but it lights you up when you do." Cassidy's throat tightened, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "Leo." "I know it's fast," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "I know you don't trust easily, and I get that, but I couldn't let this ride end without telling you how I feel. Because I don't want to be just another passing storm in your life. I want to be something solid, something worth sticking around for." The words hung in the air, heavier than any wind she'd ever tried to predict. For a long moment, Cassidy couldn't respond. Her hands gripped the metal bar, her mind scrambling for something to say, some way to protect herself. But when she looked at him, really looked at him, it was like standing at the edge of a gale. Unpredictable, exhilarating, and entirely impossible to resist. The Ferris wheel jolted slightly, signaling its descent. Still, neither of them moved, their gazes locked. Cassidy started, her voice barely above a whisper. She swallowed hard, her chest tightening. "I don't know how to do this." Leo's smile returned, softer now. "That's okay. We'll figure it out together." And as the gondola began its slow journey back down to the chaos below, Cassidy felt the faintest tug of wind inside her chest, something shifting, something breaking free. For the first time, she didn't fight it. Cassidy stood at the edge of the carnival field, her arms crossed tightly against the night's growing chill. The Ferris wheel lights twinkled behind her, casting muted colors across the damp grass at her feet. She could still hear Leo's voice, the earnestness in it, the way his words had reached her in a way most people's never did. It had felt like standing in the eye of a storm, calm, steady, while the chaos of the world spun wildly around her. Yet now, with the ride over and her feet back on solid ground, the storm inside her had begun to rage. She didn't know why she'd left so quickly, mumbling something about needing air before slipping away. Maybe it was the way Leo had looked at her, like she was someone worth waiting for, someone he believed in, even when she struggled to believe in herself. It terrified her. Leo was bold and unfiltered, so unapologetically himself, while she kept her heart guarded. Her emotions tethered like a kite she refused to let fly too high. Predictable. Safe. That's how she'd always survived. But Leo had a way of undoing her, pulling at strings she didn't even know she'd tied. The way his pirate ship kite had danced with hers earlier had felt so natural, so effortless. It wasn't until now, standing alone in the dark, that she realized how rare it was for her to let someone share her sky. And the Ferris wheel? She wanted to scoff at his grand gesture, the romantic absurdity of it all, but no part of her could. Not really. Because when he'd said those words, when he'd looked at her like she was worth every risk, she'd felt something shift inside her. Cassidy! She startled slightly, her breath catching as she turned. Leo stood a few feet away, hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, his usual grin replaced with something quieter. Concern, maybe, or patience. She couldn't be sure. He didn't move closer, didn't push her the way he sometimes did with his teasing. He just stood there, waiting. "You didn't have to follow me," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "I didn't want to leave you alone," he replied simply. "Not after everything I said up there?" Cassidy exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cool night air. "You really put it all out there, didn't you?" "I don't know how to do it any other way," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Look, if it's too much, if I'm too much, I'll back off. I get that this may not be easy for you." She looked at him then, really looked at him. He wasn't cocky now, wasn't trying to charm her with another joke or grin. For once, he seemed vulnerable, like he was standing in the same storm she'd been trying so hard to weather alone. "It's not that," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "It's just, I don't know how to do this. I've spent so much time keeping people at arm's length, afraid they'll get too close or that I'll mess it all up. And you're unpredictable, Leo. You're everything I try to avoid." He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Maybe that's what you need, Cassidy. Something unpredictable, someone who doesn't fit the rules you've set for yourself." Her chest tightened. He wasn't wrong, and that scared her even more. But as she stood there, watching him wait, not pushing or rushing her, something shifted again. She thought about the way their kites had flown together, the way they'd trusted the wind to carry them without colliding. Maybe she could learn to trust herself to do the same. With a shaky breath, she stepped toward him, closing the space between them. "You're infuriating, you know that?" she muttered, her lips curving into the faintest smile. Leo chuckled softly. "I've heard that once or twice." She met his gaze, her heart pounding, her walls cracking just enough to let him in. "I don't know how this will work, or if I'm any good at it, but I don't want to let it go without trying." His grin returned, warm and steady. "That's all I'm asking for." And when he reached for her hand, she let herself take it. For once, she wasn't afraid of where the wind might take her. The moon hung low over the ocean, its pale light spilling across the waves and turning them into shimmering silver ribbons. Cassidy stood on the edge of the rock-strewn beach, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as the breeze played with the ends of her scarf. The carnival lights were a distant memory behind them now, left behind in favor of the quiet rhythm of the tide. Her orange kite was tucked neatly in its bag at her feet, forgotten for the moment. She wasn't thinking about flying. She was thinking about the days slipping through her fingers, the way time always seemed so cruel once you realized how little of it you had. Behind her, Leo's footsteps crunched softly against the pebbles, steady and unhurried. She didn't turn, not even when he came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence against the chill of the wind. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rush of the ocean, the waves rolling up and pulling back, relentless in their rhythm. "So," Leo said finally, his voice softer than usual, stripped of its usual bravado, "you're thinking too much again." Cassidy exhaled a laugh, though it lacked any real humor. "Is that your way of telling me to stop?" "No," he said, a smile in his voice this time. "It's my way of asking what's going on in that meteorologist head of yours." She hesitated, her fingers curling tighter around the edge of her scarf. Your flight leaves in 3 days. Leo didn't respond right away, but she felt him shift beside her, his hands sliding into the pockets of his jacket. Yeah, he said after a moment, the word carrying the weight of everything unsaid between them. I'm not good at this, she admitted, her voice barely audible over the crash of the waves. I'm not good at saying how I feel, or figuring out how to deal with things when they're... She stopped, shaking her head. When they're not permanent. Leo turned to look at her, his gaze steady and patient. Cassidy, he said softly, just because something doesn't last forever doesn't mean it's not worth it. She blinked, his words hitting her somewhere deep. She turned to meet his eyes, and for once, she didn't look away. I just don't know what happens next, she admitted. His smile was faint but warm, the kind of smile that could calm even the wildest of storms. Then let's not think about what happens next, he said. Let's think about right now. She tilted her head at him, skeptical. And what does that mean exactly? It means, he said, grabbing her hand without hesitation, that we stop wasting time overthinking and go do something ridiculously spontaneous. Spontaneous? She echoed. Like what? He grinned, that familiar mischievous spark lighting up his face. Like this. Before she could argue, he was tugging her toward the shoreline, his steps quick and full of purpose. She stumbled after him, half protesting, half laughing, until they reached the edge of the water. The tide lapped at their feet, cold and sharp, but Leo didn't seem to care. He kicked off his sneakers, rolled up the cuffs of his jeans and waded in, the waves soaking him up to his knees. Leo, Cassidy exclaimed, torn between exasperation and amusement. What are you doing? Living a little, he called back, turning to face her with his arms outstretched. The moonlight caught the edges of his grin, and for a moment he looked like something out of a dream. Wild, untamed, and entirely himself. Cassidy groaned, but the corners of her mouth betrayed her, curving into a smile. You're insane, she muttered, kicking off her boots and hesitating at the water's edge. The chill bit at her toes, making her shiver. Come on, meteorologist, he teased, his voice lilting with challenge. You're not afraid of a little water, are you? She narrowed her eyes at him, her competitive streak flaring despite herself. Not even a little, she said, plunging forward into the surf without another thought. The water was freezing, the shock of it stealing her breath, but Leo's laughter made it impossible not to join him. They splashed each other like kids, the cold and the chaos washing away the weight of the unspoken goodbye hovering over them. For a little while there was no impending flight, no looming separation, just the two of them, soaked and laughing under the moonlit sky. When they finally staggered back to the shore, dripping and breathless, Cassidy found herself grinning so widely it almost hurt. Leo flopped onto the sand beside her, his wet hair sticking to his forehead. He glanced at her, his expression softer now, his grin fading into something quieter. See? He said, his voice low. Sometimes you just have to let the wind take you. Cassidy looked at him, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. Maybe he was right. Maybe for once, she could let herself believe in something unpredictable, even if it didn't last forever. The carnival had never looked so alive. String lights twinkled like constellations overhead, vibrant stalls spilled out their wares, and the hum of laughter and music mingled with the whir of rides. Cassidy stood at the edge of the field, the Ferris wheel turning slowly behind her, glowing like a beacon in the deepening twilight. She clutched her orange kite in one hand and smoothed the fabric of her sweater with the other, her nerves humming louder than the carnival noise. Relax, Leo said, appearing beside her with his usual ease, his pirate ship kite slung casually over one shoulder. He was wearing a jacket that seemed slightly too bright for the occasion and yet perfectly him. They're going to get along just fine. Cassidy glanced at him, her brows knit. You're assuming a lot. My mom doesn't do well with loud people. And your dad, well, let's just say he doesn't seem like the quiet type. Leo grinned, bumping her shoulder lightly. That's the beauty of this whole thing, Cassidy. Chaos and control, remember? They balance each other out, just like us. She rolled her eyes but couldn't fight the small smile tugging at her lips. Before she could respond, a chorus of voices reached her ears, familiar ones. She turned to see her mother, Nora, walking toward them, her neat cardigan and sensible shoes standing out against the carnival's wild colors. Behind her, Leo's dad, Marco, strode with an easy swagger, waving enthusiastically as though he were already the life of the party. Trailing them were a mix of siblings, cousins, and friends, a kaleidoscope of personalities converging in the glow of the carnival. Nora stopped in front of Cassidy, giving her a once-over in that way only mothers could. "You look nice, sweetheart," she said, her tone appreciating but cautious. Her gaze flicked to Leo, and her brow arched just slightly. "And you must be Leo." "That's me," Leo said brightly, extending a hand. "The rogue kite flyer who crashed into your daughter's airspace." Cassidy groaned, but to her surprise, Nora's lips twitched in amusement as she shook his hand. "I've heard about you." "And I've definitely heard about you," Marco said, stepping in and planting an affectionate hand on Leo's shoulder. "Cassidy, right? The one who finally got this knucklehead to focus on something other than sports for 5 minutes. Cassidy blinked, blindsided by his blunt warmth, but Leo just laughed, and she's been regretting it ever since. The ice broke with the ease of a kite catching the perfect gust. Soon, everyone was mingling. Nora asking Leo's younger sister about her college classes, Marco enthusiastically recounting Leo's childhood misadventures to Cassidy's cousins, and Cassidy herself watching it all with a mix of relief and something that felt suspiciously like joy. At some point, Leo grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the Ferris wheel. "Come on," he said, his grin playful but his eyes soft. "We've got the whole carnival to celebrate with, but there's one place we belong tonight." Cassidy let him lead her, the laughter of their blended families echoing behind them. And as they stepped into the gondola together, the lights of the carnival stretching out below, she realized this unpredictable, wondrous chaos was exactly where she belonged. The carnival buzzed with life, a symphony of music, chatter, and the occasional whoop of excitement from the rides. Cassidy stood near a cluster of picnic tables draped in mismatched cloths, each one surrounded by her family and Leo's. Colorful string lights crisscrossed above them, bathing the gathering in a warm, festive glow. The aroma of funnel cakes and roasted almonds wafted through the air, mingling with the tang of salt from the nearby ocean. Leo's dad, Marco, was in the middle of a particularly animated story, his hands gesturing wildly as he reenacted one of Leo's childhood exploits. So there he was, 8 years old, standing on top of a skateboard tied to a kite, yelling, "I can ride the wind, Dad!" Marco paused dramatically, his eyes sparkling, before throwing his hands up in mock exasperation. And then bam, straight into the neighbor's hydrangeas. Took me hours to get all the leaves out of his hair. Laughter erupted around the table, loud and unrestrained, and Cassidy found herself laughing along despite trying to stifle it. Nora, her mom, chuckled softly beside her, shaking her head. "Sounds like he hasn't changed much," Nora said dryly, casting a sidelong look at Leo, who was leaning against the edge of the table, obviously enjoying the spotlight. "Not at all," Cassidy murmured, unable to suppress a smirk. Leo grinned, tapping his chest as though wounded. "Hey now, in my defense, it was a scientific experiment. You can't expect greatness without a few hydrangea casualties along the way." "I'm surprised you didn't try mounting a kite on your bike next," teased Cassidy's cousin Emma, her tone playful. "Oh, he did," Marco said immediately, earning fresh cackles from the group. Cassidy glanced at her mom, expecting a look of mild disapproval at all the raucousness, but Nora was smiling faintly. Her shoulders relaxed in a way Cassidy hadn't seen in a long time. She was listening intently as Leo's younger sister, Mia, described her first week of graphic design classes in college. Nora even leaned closer, her voice soft but kind as she asked, "Do you ever sell your designs? I know a few people who might be interested in that kind of talent." Mia lit up, her shyness melting under the warmth of Nora's attention. Cassidy blinked in surprise. Her mom wasn't exactly known for casual friendliness, but something about the evening seemed to be softening her usual edges. Meanwhile, Marco had enlisted Cassidy's Uncle Paul in a debate about carnival food, though Marco's booming laugh made it clear he wasn't taking it too seriously. "Corn dogs are the backbone of this country, my friend," he declared, raising a fried golden stick like a torch. "Funnel cakes are just sugar-coated chaos." Cassidy shook her head, torn between mortification and amusement. She felt Leo's hand slide into hers, and she turned to find him grinning at her. his expression softening into something quieter, more thoughtful. "They're getting along," Leo said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I told you it would work." Cassidy followed his gaze, taking in the sight of their families laughing together, swapping stories as though they'd known each other for years. A warmth spread through her chest, unexpected and comforting. "They are," she admitted, her fingers tightening around his. "Of course they are," Leo said, his grin widening. "You and I set the tone, chaos and control, remember?" Cassidy rolled her eyes but couldn't keep the smile off her face. "You really think you're the chaos in this relationship, huh?" "Oh, absolutely," he said, tugging her closer, his voice full of mock seriousness. "And you, my love, are the glue holding it together." "More like the one keeping the hydrangeas safe," she muttered, earning a laugh from him. As the evening stretched on, they moved freely between conversations. Cassidy laughing with Mia over her ridiculous sketches, Leo humoring Nora as she asked him about the intricacies of professional sports travel. It was strange watching these two very different worlds collide, but instead of clashing, they mixed like colors in a carnival sunset. By the time the Ferris wheel lights began to dim and the scent of the ocean grew stronger with the cooling night air, Cassidy found herself leaning into Leo's side, her usual walls nowhere to be found. It wasn't perfect. There were still quirks and mismatched edges between their families, but it was good. It was real. And as Marco's booming voice declared the evening a success worthy of a kite-flying celebration, Cassidy couldn't help but glance up at the Ferris wheel, her heart light as the kites they'd flown together that first day. The Ferris wheel cast a golden glow over the darkened carnival, its lights flickering in a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the pounding of Cassidy's heart. She stood with Leo at the edge of the grassy field, the laughter and music of the carnival fading into the background like a distant hum. Above them, the Ferris wheel's gondolas slowly turned, their movements hypnotic against the inky sky dotted with faint stars. Cassidy glanced at Leo, his face illuminated by the warm lights. His hair was tousled from the breeze that had swept through the carnival earlier, and his pirate ship kite bag hung loosely from his shoulder, forgotten in the moment. He was quiet for once, a rare stillness settling over him that made Cassidy's chest ache. "You're unusually calm," she said, tilting her head to study him. Her voice sounded smaller than she intended, as if the weight of the moment had stolen some of her confidence. Leo's lips curved into a soft smile. Even chaos needs to take a deep breath every now and then. His eyes stayed on her, steady and unflinching, and she felt like he was looking at her in a way no one ever had before. Like he saw all the cracks and edges she tried to hide and didn't flinch from them. Instead, he embraced them. "What?" she asked, shifting under his gaze. "You? Just you," he murmured, taking a step closer. "You keep surprising me, meteorologist." She raised an eyebrow, fighting the way her pulse quickened. "I thought I was predictable." "You're not," he said softly, shaking his head. "Not even a little." He reached out, his fingers brushing hers, and the warmth of his touch sent a ripple through her. "You keep me guessing, and I don't think I've ever liked that as much as I do with you." Cassidy's throat tightened, her instinct to deflect warring with the fragile hope blooming in her chest. She looked away, her gaze drifting to the Ferris wheel as it rose and fell in its endless, steady cycle. "You know this won't be easy, right?" she said finally, her voice quieter now. "I'm not the kind of person who just jumps into things. I overthink, I get scared, I know," Leo interrupted gently, stepping even closer. He turned her hand over and laced his fingers with hers, grounding her. "I know it won't be easy. But that's the thing, Cassidy. I don't want easy. I want you. Even if it's messy, even if it's unpredictable." Her breath caught, and she found herself looking at him again, unable to hold herself back. There was no bravado in his gaze now, no teasing grin, just sincerity, open and raw, the kind that made her want to run and stay all at once. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I know," he said, his grip on her hand tightening just enough to reassure her. "But I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure it out one day at a time, one storm at a time." Cassidy let out a shaky laugh, the tension in her chest softening just slightly. "You make it sound so simple." Leo's grin returned, boyish and warm. "It's not, but it's worth it." The Ferris wheel loomed above them, its lights casting shifting patterns across their faces. Cassidy took a deep breath, letting the moment settle over her like the first gust of wind before a storm. And for once, she didn't try to predict what came next. She just let herself trust it. "Okay," she said, her voice steady now. "Let's see where the wind takes us." Leo squeezed her hand, his grin softening into something quieter, something that felt like a promise. And under the glowing Ferris wheel, surrounded by the hum of laughter and the rhythm of the carnival, they stood together, ready to embrace whatever the unpredictable winds of life had in store.